Okay, so, when you think about the Crusades right away, you think valiant knights, shining armor, dramatic
Yeah.
rescues, all very pure, very religious zeal.
Right.
But maybe we should rethink that picture a little bit. The,
Yeah.
the article that you shared with me, how did the Crusades actually work? It kind of shakes things up a bit.
hmm
It paints a different picture, maybe a more surprising reality than what we traditionally think of.
It absolutely does. It's remarkable how much those romantic images persist even today.
Yeah.
And this deep dive is a great opportunity for us to kind of go beyond, that romanticized version
All right.
and look at the much more down to earth, even strategic ways that these expeditions actually functioned.
Right.
Our goal today should be to really unpack the practicalities.
Right.
How did these massive military and logistical operations actually work?
Right.
As you said, the sources reveal a story that is much more complex and oftentimes quite gritty.
Yeah, and I love that you said gritty because that's what I was thinking about too when I was reading this. Forget the lone invincible hero idea for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
The article highlights a truth that is much less glamorous.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
A lot of these knights weren't actually killed in, glorious combat. They were taken out by disease,
Oh, yeah.
poor sanitation,
Yeah.
even something as basic as dysentery took a huge toll.
Right.
So right away, a key insight here is that this idea of the romantic knight going it alone is completely false.
Yeah.
Medieval warfare was a team effort,
Yes, very much so.
heavily reliant on this logistical support system.
Absolutely. And that's such a crucial point because it really underscores the vulnerability of these medieval armies,
Hmm.
despite, this imposing image that we have of the armored knight on horseback.
Right.
It wasn't just about, an individual's ability to fight.
Yeah.
These knights were heavily reliant on extensive support networks,
Right.
their squires, armorers, cooks, stable hands, all of
Ah.
these individuals who played a role behind the scenes to keep them equipped, keep them fed, and keep them mounted.
Yeah.
So it was truly a whole system.
It's interesting, too, because that whole idea of the support system
Mm-hmm.
really kind of feeds into the next question that I had,
Mm-hmm.
which is funding and logistics.
Right.
It's not like it was just, some wealthy guy said, hey, I'm going to ride off to the Holy Land. Good luck, everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Where did the massive financial backing come from
Yeah.
to make all of this happen?
Yeah.
The article mentions noble patronage, obviously significant contributions from the church,
Sure.
along with whatever personal resources, these knights could muster.
Right.
Can you even imagine the sheer scale of coordinating these movements?
Yeah.
Armies, horses, supplies across these vast distances.
Oh, it's mind-boggling.
It's really mind-boggling.
I mean, it really raises a fascinating point about the administrative capabilities of the time.
Uh-huh.
I think we tend to get, really focused on the battles themselves.
Sure.
But the ability to, organize and sustain these large-scale movements of people and resources across continents, even with all of the inevitable challenges that came with that.
Yeah.
It speaks volumes about the organizational efforts involved.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's impressive.
Yeah, and it's funny, when I was reading this article, there was a fact in there that really made me do a double take.
Okay.
The term crusade that we use so freely today apparently wasn't even around for centuries after the events themselves.
Oh, wild, isn't it?
It's wild. The article points out that the French, they started using crusade in the 1500s,
Wow.
and the English even later in the 1700s.
Uh-huh.
Before that, people who participated in these things, they were simply seen as people who had taken the cross.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
really changes how you think about it.
It does. And it's interesting because it highlights how historical narratives and labels, they evolve over time.
Yeah.
The article gives a really useful definition of a crusade. A crusade, they say, is a war initiated by Christian powers, typically with papal blessing against perceived threats to Christianity.
Okay.
So that helps us to kind of categorize these events retrospectively.
Uh-huh.
And it's really important to remember, as the article points out, that the targets were not solely Muslim powers in the Levant.
Right.
You had conflicts like the one against the Cathar heretics in southern France,
Right.
which also fall under this definition of a crusade.
Okay.
And that really broadens our understanding, I think, considerably.
So it wasn't just about, reclaiming holy sites in the Middle East.
Right, exactly.
And a major factor, I think, in, getting people to participate
Yeah.
in these often dangerous journeys was the power of papal bulls. and the promise of indulgences.
Hmm.
Can you explain how those worked as motivators?
Sure. So the concept of indulgences was a remarkably effective tool.
Okay.
What it offered crusaders was forgiveness for their sins,
Right.
and importantly, a degree of protection from earthly repercussions. Now, if we think about this in the context of medieval life, which was, profoundly religious,
Sure.
the promise of spiritual cleansing and, a more favorable afterlife held immense appeal.
Right.
So the core insight here, I think, is that the church very masterfully blended spiritual rewards
Mm-hmm.
with tangible earthly benefits to incentivize participation.
Okay.
It's really a very powerful early form of employee motivation if you think about it that way.
It's like a spiritual insurance policy.
Kind of, yeah.
But the article also mentions other incentives too, like legal immunities,
Mm.
relief from debts, guarantees for the safety of their families and property back home.
Right.
That sounds like a pretty comprehensive medieval benefits package.
It really does. What's noteworthy, I think, is this combination of spiritual and practical advantages.
Right.
And the article makes this really fascinating point about the First Crusade.
Okay.
It served in part as a strategic move to kind of redirect the energies of Europe's, violent board knights.
Yeah.
And point them elsewhere and keep them from causing trouble within Europe itself.
Interesting.
It's like, trying to keep unruly teenagers busy with a constructive activity instead of them, wreaking havoc at home.
Yeah.
And I think that reveals a level of political strategy that we don't always associate with, this
Sure.
traditional narrative of purely religious fervor.
So how do they spread the word
Yeah.
and convince these often unruly nobles to leave their lands and head east?
Right.
The article touches on the role of recruitment and propaganda.
Indeed. So you had traveling preachers, often from influential monastic orders like the Benedictines and Dominicans,
Okay.
who were really instrumental in disseminating news and generating enthusiasm for these crusades.
Right.
I mean, they were essentially the PR department for these expeditions.
Yeah.
And their message was not solely focused on, spiritual rewards.
Okay.
They also heavily promoted the potential for material gain, the spoils of war, the acquisition of land and wealth in the East.
Sure. I can only imagine the type of persuasive language that they used.
Oh, yeah.
It must have painted a very specific picture
Yes.
of both the rewards and the enemy.
Exactly. The article highlights how those who were perceived as enemies were often portrayed as barbaric
Uh-huh.
and as a direct threat to Christian beliefs and lands.
Right.
And this really emphasized the moral and religious obligation for Christians to intervene.
Yeah.
This type of propaganda, demonizing the opposition, was a common tactic to rally support and create a sense of righteous cause.
It's quite a contrast to the image of noble knights when you consider this other detail in the article about them causing trouble at home.
Yeah.
It mentions these tournaments that were
Yeah.
super destructive, almost like real battles, even involving pillaging.
Right.
That doesn't sound like a pious defender of the faith.
No, it's a stark contrast, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what's interesting is the article points out how these tournaments gradually evolved
Oh, yeah.
with the introduction of rules and blunted weapons. And they eventually became more akin to the spectacles that we often imagine today.
Okay.
It's almost as if they had to kind of learn to channel their martial energies in a less destructive way
Right.
within their own territories.
So while religious conviction was undoubtedly present,
Of course.
the article really makes a point of saying there were other significant earthly motivations at play.
Oh, absolutely.
Promise of land wealth, increased social standing.
Mm-hmm.
This all played a role in why people joined the Crusades.
Absolutely. And I think the example of the Albigensian Crusade is particularly revealing.
Okay.
The article notes how participants in that crusade could seize towns and territories as a direct reward.
Wow.
So, that really highlights the tangible incentives beyond spiritual devotion that fueled some of these campaigns.
Okay.
I mean, it wasn't solely about faith. There was a very real potential for personal enrichment.
Interesting.
Very interesting.
So then there's the issue of commitment.
Right.
The article mentions knights sometimes only signed up for like the bare minimum 40 days of service.
Oh, yeah. Just enough to get the indulgence.
Yeah, just to gain their indulgence.
And then head home.
And then they just head home, leaving everybody else hanging,
Yeah.
often leaving these ongoing campaigns severely understaffed.
Yeah.
That must have created constant logistical and strategic headaches.
Oh, undoubtedly it led to recurring challenges. The article actually draws a really insightful parallel to the American Revolutionary War,
Okay.
where the Continental Army also struggled with short-term enlistments.
Uh-huh.
And I think this underscores a fundamental problem in sustaining long military efforts with
Sure.
volunteer forces, regardless of the historical period or the
Yeah.
specific context.
Okay, so to distill everything down,
Yeah.
what are the key takeaways that you got from the article about how the Crusades actually worked,
Sure.
beyond those traditional heroic narratives?
Okay, well, I think first it's essential to recognize that the Crusades were far more than just straightforward religious conflicts
Yeah.
between, good and evil.
Sure.
Political ambitions and economic opportunities were incredibly influential driving forces.
Yeah.
Second, I think that idealized image of the selfless, chivalrous knight
Right.
simply doesn't align with much of the historical evidence,
Right.
which points to often opportunistic and even self-serving behaviors.
Yeah.
And finally, I think it's important to recognize that the Catholic Church, in many ways, the architect of these ventures, employed a remarkably sophisticated strategy.
Yeah.
They cleverly combine these spiritual inducements, like indulgences, with very practical promises of land,
Ah.
plunder, legal protection in
Right.
order to mobilize what the article very accurately described as often unruly nobles.
So we started with this, popular image of shining knights and unwavering religious devotion, and what we've discovered through this deep dive
Yeah.
into how did the Crusades actually work
Yeah,
is a much more nuanced and, dare I say, human story.
I think so.
It's less about purely selfless acts of faith
Yeah.
and more about a complex interaction of belief, financial considerations, and good old-fashioned self-interest.
Precisely. And I think the article's analogy of the Crusades as like a medieval corporation
Uh-huh.
mobilizing a workforce for a risky overseas project
Look.
is incredibly apt.
Yep.
They essentially offered this comprehensive benefits package,
Mhm.
indulgences rights to plunder debt relief,
Yeah,
to incentivize participation in this dangerous undertaking.
right.
It's a really fresh perspective on these historical events.
It is, and it makes you think, given all these very practical and political motivations that
Yeah.
we discussed,
Mm-hmm.
how might our understanding of other historical holy wars
Right.
need to be re-examined?
Mhm.
Perhaps, these underlying drivers of a lot of these large-scale conflicts throughout history
Mhm.
are more multifaceted
Yeah.
and less purely ideological than we often assume.
That's a great point.
It's definitely something to think about long after our deep dive today.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
This was really eye-opening.
My pleasure.
And to all of our listeners out there, be sure to check back in with us next week for another deep dive
See you then.
into a fascinating historical topic.